Hello again, everyone. Yeah, that was a real quote that I put up there on the header card at the start of the video. General Curtis LeMay actually said that. We tried bombing North Korea back into the Stone Age, and we damn near succeeded. I just kind of put that up there to get everybody's attention. Everybody's been talking about, for like the last 50 years, has been talking about how to solve the problem of North Korea. And you get all these outlandish ideas, and there have been attempts. They've all failed. But people are still talking about it. I just picked a few articles at random here. This is from the Brookings Institute in May of 2003. North Korea, the problem that won't go away. Not long ago here from, this is Time Magazine, just recently. 6 experts on how we can solve the problem. Another one from CNN. What will it take to stop North Korea? From the BBC. North Korea, what can the outside world do? I love that, the outside world. Then here's Secretary of State Tillerson, Rex Tillerson. He calls for global action to stop North Korea nuclear program. Well, that's wishful thinking on his part because it's not going to happen. So, what seems to be the problem? Well, to my way of thinking, if you're going to solve a problem, you have to understand the nature of the problem. I mean, that's just common sense. So if you have a problem with somebody else, and you're going to sit down and try to negotiate a solution, well, you have to understand the other person's perspective on the problem every bit as much as you understand your own. So you have to look at the problem from their point of view. And I don't think the United States has been doing this. I don't think they've been looking at it from North Korea's point of view. Doesn't mean North Korea is right, or doesn't mean they're wrong. By the same token, doesn't mean the United States is right or wrong. That can be sorted out in negotiations. But whenever you sit down to try to solve a problem, to reach some sort of an agreement, you have to understand the other person's perspective completely. And so I just, this caused me to think that I don't think people understand the history of Korea and North Korea. I didn't up till just probably 5 years ago. When I was at university, I studied medieval history. That was my thing. And I never even gave a thought to Korea or anything like that until just recently. So academically, I'm not well versed in it. So I've gone back and done some reading, but I wished I'd have studied this 20, 30, 40 years ago. I really wished I had. But anyway, when you look at the history, you really have to conclude that the United States has not been very kind to North Korea or to Korea as a whole, but it's particularly North Korea. And there's really been three areas, and I'll reiterate them here, or I'll run through them real quickly here. Along about in the late 1800s, Russia began a push, Imperial Russia began a push to the Pacific. And this is all part of Russia, but they started populating and exploiting the resources of Eastern Russia, in the Far East. And they got into Manchuria, and here I put up a map. See, and I've outlined Manchuria in blue. So they pushed into there, and then further east to what is now Vladivostok. and Sakhalin Island, but especially right there, Vladivostok. Well, this made the Japanese nervous because the Japanese, they were the imperial Japanese. They had designs on putting together an empire, and they wanted Korea and Manchuria, and Russia was moving into the area. So they couldn't come to an agreement. Russia actually offered to Japan to divide Korea along the 39th parallel. Just Korea is now divided along the 38th, but I believe they were divided in the 39th. And Japan refused the offer because Japan wanted the entire Korean peninsula and Manchuria. So they went to war. And Russia lost the war to Japan. So now Japan had the whole schmear. And at the Treaty of Portsmouth in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, 1905, Theodore Roosevelt and his Secretary of State Taft, they hammered out a treaty between Russia and Japan. And Roosevelt essentially gave Korea to Japan. Here, you have it handed over. And the Koreans came rushing to Portsmouth and said, please don't hand us over to our hereditary enemies. They hate us. They've invaded us a couple times before, and they did bad things to us. And Roosevelt blew them off because Roosevelt wanted his Nobel Peace Prize. And so Theodore Roosevelt got his Nobel Peace Prize in part for handing Korea to Japan. So in 1910, I believe it was 1910, Korea was fully incorporated into Japan, and it ceased to be a nation. And this was pretty bad because the Japanese treated the Koreans worse than farm animals. I mean, they treated them very badly. And they took, a couple 100,000 young women and just pulled them out of the country and populated. There was brothels all over, wherever there were Japanese military units, installations, and they were in China and all over the place. The Japanese put brothels and populated them with Korean young women. Here's a picture of some of them here. And they were called comfort women. And so finally, I mean, this was a pretty bad situation. And then World War II came along. And the United States and Japan went to war. Japan was defeated. And the Korean Peninsula was liberated. Only problem is it was divided between the Soviet Union and Japan, or between the Soviet Union and the United States. And, you know, you take that for what it's worth, but it was divided. And this is a bad thing. So in 1948, it was under military, South Korea, the Soviet Union occupied North Korea for a couple of 3 years. And then Kim Il-sung invited them to leave, and they left. The United States never left South Korea. And it was under a United States military government until 1948, and then the United States did the second really bad thing to Korea. They installed a fellow by the name of Syngman Rhee as the strong man. And Syngman Rhee was a certified psychopath. He was crazy. The reason why the United States put him in there is because, well, the State Department didn't want Syngman Rhee in South Korea. but the State Department was in Washington, and the United States military government and the CIA was in South Korea. So they put Syngman Rhee in there anyway. The reason why, according to what I read, why they selected Syngman Rhee was because he was the only potential Korean leader that could speak English, and he spoke it very well. He had a PhD from Princeton, and I think he had a degree from Harvard and went from Columbia, if I'm not mistaken. His MA from Columbia, a bachelor's from Harvard, something like that, and then he had a PhD from Princeton. So the U.S. government, the U.S. military put him in there. Yeah, you're our man. Problem is that Syngman Rhee liked to massacre people. That was his thing. He liked to slaughter people, his own people. What had happened after World War II is that a lot of people don't know this, and these people trying to solve the problem of Korea don't know this, but North Korea Pyongyang had once been known as Jerusalem of the North. Been a lot of Presbyterian, some Baptist Presbyterian missionaries in North Korea. And about 37%, close to 40% of the population of North Korea were Christian. Now when the Soviet Union came in, Soviet military moved into North Korea, the Christians voted with their feet and went across the border to South Korea because Marxist-Leninism and Christianity are incompatible ideologies, and the Christians left, most of them. Well, when they got over to South Korea, Syngman Rhee, being the psycho that he was, he regarded everybody coming from North Korea as a communist sympathizer, communist collaborator, a communist spy. So rather than sort them out, he just killed them. And just let God sort them out. God will know who the real Christians are, so fine, you know. When they get to heaven, God will know. That was probably his attitude. Kill them all, let God sort them out. So there's a lot of massacres that Syngman Rhee did, and I put up a little thing here just to give you an idea. There were a bunch of bad ones. I have a list here somewhere. Yeah, here's the list, and you can look it up if you like. This is just off of Wikipedia. List of massacres in North Korea. And there was just a whole bunch of them. But the really bad ones, I put up a card here. The really bad ones was the Jeju Uprising. I believe that was in 1948. Yeah, 1948. And that was between 14,000 and 30,000 people were killed. And then something called the National Defense Corps Incident. I'm not quite sure what that was. But 50,000 to 90,000 people were slaughtered. And then the December massacres, nobody really knows how many people were killed there, but many, many thousands. The big one was the Bodo League massacre. Between 100,000 and 1.2 million people were killed, were murdered by South Korean police and military. It's a wide guesstimate because nobody knows for sure, but a lot of people say 200,000-300,000, but it could be as many as 1.2 million. So that's a lot of people that were massacred. And these are men, women, and children. And these were all people from the north that came to the south for refuge. And the United States military stood by and did nothing. And the U.S. military controlled the South Korean military. They controlled the South Korean police. Because basically, even though Syngman Rhee was in there, Syngman Rhee was a sock puppet in the United States. Whatever the U.S. said, Syngman Rhee did. But they made no effort. The U.S. made no effort to stop the massacres. Just stood by and watched them, and they could have. The British soldiers who were there, British military, in small units, they saved a few people. But the Brits remarked that the United States military just stood there and watched these people being machine gunned to death, and nothing was done. And that leads us right in. I believe the Bodo League Massacre, if I'm not mistaken, the date of the Bodo League Massacre was on June 27th, 1950. 2 days before that, President Kim Il-sung had sent his army across the DMZ into the south. So it was on the 25th. So on the 27th, just 2 days after, then Syngman Rhee gave the order to kill everybody in the Bodo League Massacre. And so it was pretty much a pretty terrible thing that happened. And no one wants to talk about it. No one wants to admit it. Even North Korea doesn't talk about it. I haven't seen anything about the Bodo League Massacre in North Korean media. And that surprises me. And I don't know why they have never mentioned it. At least I haven't seen it. They may have mentioned it. I haven't seen it. But then that leads us right away into Curtis LeMay. And his thing was, his firm belief was that if you bombed the civilian population, the military would stop fighting because they would lose heart. So if you kill all the civilians, then that leaves the military out there unsupported, and that's the end of the war. That was his thing. So LeMay went after the civilian population of North Korea in his bombing campaign, all these B-29s. And he'd sent word to the Pentagon through, I think, back channels. He asked if he could use incendiaries on North Korea like he did on Japan. And then the U.S. military burned down Dresden, the famous firestorm of Dresden, and I don't know how many people were killed there using incendiaries. So LeMay had used incendiaries on Tokyo and other places in Japan during World War II. So now he wanted to do the same thing in North Korea. And the Pentagon said, no, that's not a good idea because you'll kill too many civilians. He went ahead and did it anyway. And here's his quote. And I'll put up the card here so you can read it along with me. So we went over there and fought the war and eventually burned down every town in North Korea. Over a period of 3 years or so, we killed off 20% of the population of Korea as direct casualties of war or from starvation and exposure. So that's the war on the civilian population. And out of a population, and LeMay was right, it's 20% about. Out of a population of some 9 million people, 1.8 million people died as a result of, mostly as a result of the bombing and so forth. And, but it was a nasty, vicious war. And what the U.S. should have done, when Kim Il-sung, when he sent his troops into South Korea, he pushed all the way almost down to the tip. He took 80% of South Korea, and the U.S. finally pushed him back north of the DMZ. That's where it should have ended, and that would have saved 1.8 million lives, plus a lot of lives in South Korea. But the U.S. didn't. They pushed it all the way north, and then the Chinese got involved. And then MacArthur wanted to use nuclear weapons in Manchuria and China. And that's when Truman fired him. So the U.S. released the four horsemen of the apocalypse on North Korea. Disease, war, famine, and death. And yet the people survived. Somehow, miraculously, these people survived. On paper, they shouldn't have. You lose 20% of your population, that's the end of things. And they, not only did they survive, but they survived with their ideology intact. It hasn't wavered. If you read North Korea media very much, they always talk a lot about faith. It's like a quasi-religious thing. The faith, the belief, the faith. And people believe in the system. So that was the three things right there that the United States has really done to Korea. Handing Korea to Japan in 1905. And installing the psycho Syngman Rhee in the South. It massacred all these people. And then turning loose Curtis LeMay and the bombing campaign on North Korea. So what's that got to do with anything with solving the problem? Well, I don't know. But you have to at least come to grips with what happened. If you're going to sit down at the table with representatives of North Korea, you got to say, okay, fine. I kind of understand where you're coming from. You really don't like what we did. That part I understand. This is why the North Koreans are screwing all these nukes together and launching rockets, because they remember what the U.S. did to them before, and they'd rather that not happen again. I mean, it was terrible what happened during the Korean War to these people. And so, this motivates them. And if anybody thinks North Korea is going to be giving up their nukes, that's not going to happen. But people say, oh, well, before we talk to North Korea, they got to give up their nukes. Well, that's what we call a non-starter. It's not going to happen. But you have to understand the nature of the problem and how they feel about it. Now, maybe they feel a bit different, and North Korea is not entirely hostile to America as a concept, America as a people. It's just the government. They sort that out. The American culture is something else. The American policy is what they have a problem with. So what would I do? Well, it's almost an insoluble problem. But however you're going to solve the problem, it's probably going to cost some money from American taxpayers. People say, well, we're going to spend money in North Korea. Well, yeah, probably. But we already spent in the Middle East. Here's a study from Brown University. U.S. budgetary cost of wars through 2016, $4.79 trillion. This is for Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Syria, the bulk of it in Iraq. And remember, the Iraq War was based on a lie. The CIA lied to get the U.S. involved. That curveball guy, you can Google it. Just Google curveball Iraq or curveball CIA. So almost $5 trillion based on a lie. That's what we spent. We had no business being in the Middle East. So this is the question, how much are you willing to spend to prevent a war? Not fight one, but to prevent one. 10 billion, 100 billion? Yeah, I'd probably spend 100 billion. Call it reparations if you want to. You know, I might try that angle. If I was negotiating with North Korea, I should sit down at the table and said, look, you know, I feel bad about what we did to you. What we did was wrong. It was actually evil. So we can't repair the damage as far as, you know, bring back the people that have died, but maybe in some small way we can make it up to you. And my goal, I think what's really important is my goal would to be to raise the standard of living of the people of North Korea. That would be my ultimate goal. And so the money that I would contribute would go towards that goal, to raise the standard of living of the people of North Korea. And when that happens, only good things are a result of that happening. Only good things take place. When the standard of living drops, bad things happen. And the reverse is true when everybody gets more money, more stuff, more consumer goods. So I think that's the way to go if you want to try to solve the problem. I would try to take that approach. I'd say, fine, you have your nuclear weapons, you got them. And I would do a treaty. I mean, that would be something I'd really try to do. Let's do the treaty. You know, we got the armistice that was signed on July 27th, 1953. Well, it's about time to do the treaty. Let's do the treaty. And then let's help you out here and raise the standard of living of everybody. And once you do that, I think other things will just naturally fall into place. You know, I do think that will happen. And then once North Korea has a higher standard of living where people are making more money, then I believe reunification between the two halves of Korea will be much easier to take place, much easier to happen. And if you tell North Korea, look, we're going to help you here to try to, you know, get reunification, make it happen. North Korea was very enthusiastic about that. That's the one thing they want to see happen. The only fly in the ointment is South Korea. I don't know how you'd get them to, you know, to sign on to this. You know, I don't know how you do that. Of course, I would stop those stupid war games, Key Resolve and Full Legal, that they run every spring. I mean, that serves no useful purpose, but pisses North Korea off, and it just makes them want to screw together more nukes. So stop that. Stop antagonizing them. Stop making them mad. And just try to cut a deal. But it would be really tough to do. And negotiating is not an easy thing to do, especially after what's happened to Korea. So it would be a long process, but it sure beats war. And you know, I'd be willing to spend, you know, $100 billion, a couple $100 billion to prevent a war, than to spend almost $5 trillion to fight a useless war that is based on a lie. So anyway, that's all I have to say about that for the moment, and give you something to think about. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.